I'm the editor of Wetpixel, and I'd like to welcome you all to Wetpixel Live. What I thought I'd like to discuss today is to discuss a bit of an overview on the files that still cameras produce. So this is kind of an overview of some of the ways that still cameras will store and reproduce our images, and then how we interact with those as part of workflow. And this really comes from a very interesting discussion that's going on the Wetpixel forum at the moment. I'll put the link in the comment section or in the video description, relating to the video that we published recently of Alex's workflow, and how he gets his images from camera through eventually to publication and all the stages that he follows through in between. So, right, so the first type of file that I think most photographers, most underwater photographers will be familiar with is a raw file. And what's a raw file? Well, a raw file is the information that's gathered by the camera's sensor at the point of capture. So in general, it has a limited, very, very limited amount of adjustments done to any format, and it is just a collection of essentially data that relates to brightness, contrast, what's in the scene, what is where and which in terms of position within the on the sensor, and how the camera has captured it. So obviously that will involve things like the EXIF data of the camera, so shutter speed, ISO values, aperture, all that kind of stuff, camera model, all that kind of stuff will be stored in the raw file. Now, the image that you view on the back of your camera when you press the review button is actually a JPEG rendering of that raw file, because the raw file itself is just data, and you can't look at a raw file and see an image in it. It has to have some kind of processing in order to make that an image that you view. And as I say, the image that you see on the back of the camera is actually rendering out a JPEG version of the raw image that you've stored on your file. Now, I think most underwater photographers will probably be fairly familiar with this, so I'll go fairly quickly through this. Why shoot in RAW? Well, the great advantage of capturing as much data as possible is that when you come to edit it, you can afford to lose more data. It's about editing headspace, as it's called. When we edit, we inevitably lose some data in some area of the image, and by capturing all the image, then we have the choice about which bits of data we keep and which bits we deliberately choose to ignore, or which bits we deliberately choose to discard. That's part of the advantage of shooting in RAW, in that we can actually make a conscious decision as to which bits of the image are important to us, or which parts of the information, should I say, is important to us. If we capture in one of the other formats that most cameras will allow you to capture in, those decisions are basically taken for us because we're getting a packaged processed image that's arriving onto the memory card of the camera. Now, there might be some circumstances where shooting in JPEG may be advantageous, and these would be examples when, for example, we're in the field, we need to produce images very quickly, we have no particular demand to edit, which is fairly rare, but it's possible. Then certainly shooting in JPEG is a possibility, and most modern SLRs and mirrorless cameras, and most compacts even now, will give you a choice for different varieties of JPEG, normally in terms of quality, but also in terms of size sometimes as well. So if you know that you need quick images for a publication, they're not worried about quality, or you're just going to use them online, then there may be an option to using in JPEG. And there also, of course, may be the option with some camera models with two memory card slots, of being able to shoot one where you capture the raw files and one where you capture the JPEG files. So that will allow you to do both. So that may well be an option too. All right, so in terms of the workflow pipeline, the raw data itself, obviously stored to a card, goes into a card reader, that then gets imported into the computer. And at this point, what you're importing into the computer is just data. It doesn't, if we were to look at it, it would just be a collection of ones and zeros effectively. And so it doesn't look like an image. Within that raw data will be all sorts of things embedded, including a JPEG image, which is the one that the camera has displayed on your viewfinder. So there is a JPEG image in there, but it's by no means a high resolution or detailed JPEG. It's detailed enough to be allowed to use for image review on the screen of your camera, but it's certainly by no means a fully fledged high-res JPEG image or anything. So we're going to bring that into the computer, and as Alex discussed, and I'll discuss in a future episode as well, there are lots of different ways of doing that of our raw editing pipeline. But essentially, we're going to use a piece of software to interpret the data that we find on the card, and different people, DxO, Adobe, Luminar, all these various Affinity, all these people use different, slightly different engines to effectively develop the raw data, and they interpret the raw data, and from that again produce a JPEG, which is what you effectively see on screen. And you will never particularly export that JPEG, but it's just that's what you're viewing on screen. So there are different raw pipelines. Different people will say one is better than the other. That's a discussion for a different point, different time. But certainly we need to have some kind of device which allows us to take that raw data and view it. Both Windows and Mac have built-in raw viewing options as well. So whichever computer system you have, you can also view them as part of the system properties. Although to be fair, they're not as updated as regularly with updates. And it's important to stress that raw formats are proprietary to each individual camera as well as each brand of camera. So typically Nikon files have the suffix NEF, NEF, which I think stands for Nikon Electronic File, but a NEF produced by a D500 is different to a NEF produced by a D850. The same is true with a Canon file produced by a 7D Mark II compared to a 5D Mark IV. So they're all different, although they all may look the same in terms of the suffix, they actually are different files. And because if you have a program that can read one, it doesn't necessarily mean you can read the other. Now, fortunately, most of the image program manufacturers and software developers keep these things pretty well updated. So as new cameras come out, they will add raw capability to their software, and in order to allow it to keep current and allow it to be used. With that in mind, and there's one special type of raw file that I wanted to discuss very briefly. It's called a DNG. And this is an Adobe proprietary format. It stands for digital negative, unsurprisingly, DNG. And the idea here was to try and develop a standardized raw file. Obviously, the concern is, particularly for archival purposes, we could see a situation in the future where a particular type of raw file is no longer supported by any imaging software. As cameras get older, less and less images around, there's always the possibility that it might drop off the end and we would lose the ability to view files from some specific cameras. So the idea behind DNG is it's a great archival universal format. Adobe have committed to support it forever, whatever that means. And so it allows the images to be archived in a format that theoretically can be read forever. As far as I know, there aren't many cameras producing DNG files. There is an option to produce DNG files on some smartphone cameras, for example. So these things may be coming, but currently most of the SLRs, mirrorless cameras have proprietary formats still, rather than an option to produce DNGs. So that means that if we're going to choose to archive or store or view our images in DNG format, at some point we need to do a conversion. So we're going to convert the proprietary raw file format to a DNG file. And whilst that itself, the Adobe have a DNG converter that's free, you can download it and convert files to your heart's content. It can also be done from within many software packages, where you can take your raw files and convert them all to DNG. I would sound one note of caution, and this is based on experience, in that you have now got an additional processing step. And the first problem with that is it takes more time. So bluntly, you've got another process. Processes take time. So when you're editing thousands and thousands of images, that's going to slow you down. Possibly not a lot, but it's going to slow you down. The second issue, and this is arguably more serious, I certainly have had a problem with, in this case, Olympus files, .rf raw files that have been converted to DNG, and the DNG conversion process has produced some really nasty artifacts in the images. So it's happened to me. I'm not going to say it's going to happen to everyone. I'm sure plenty of people have had a positive experience of converting Olympus raw files to DNG. And it may be something to do with the process when I did it. But again, when we add an extra process, we always run the risk of there being another problem. So bear that in mind before you make the decision, right, I'm going to run anything in DNG because it'll make it last forever. There's always a downside. So the downside is time and the potential for the files themselves to be corrupted in some way and for artifacts to develop inside them, which is obviously not something you want, particularly in an archival format. All right, so now we've got our images in, we've imported them into our software of choice, and the software has produced JPEG so we can look at them. And now what are we going to do next? Well, depending on the type of editor, we may well be able to edit the raw files. And typically when we're editing raw files, and again, this is not universal, but the most common way of doing it is we'll do it what's known as non-destructively, which means that we would attach a list of instructions to each raw file, which the software recognizes, and when it opens that raw file, it will therefore read those instructions and apply them to the raw information. So if I edit the exposure in my image, for example, then what happens is when I open that file within the software, it goes, oh, there's an instruction here to add a stop of exposure, and it will therefore add that stop of exposure, and you'll see that on screen. So notice if I want to get rid of that instruction, all I need to do is get rid of it by pressing reset or changing the exposure adjustment in the develop module, or however the particular software application you're using does it. So that I can always step back. This is why we call it non-destructive. I'm not changing pixels. I'm just adding instructions that basically affect the way that file is impacted by the software as I open it. Now, obviously, if I'm editing a file in DxO Photolab and I decide for some reason I want to then take that file over to Lightroom, it can be done, but it doesn't necessarily mean that DxO's instructions are going to work in Lightroom and vice versa. Now, I'm not saying it can't be done, it can be done. It is possible to convert file formats over, and most commonly that's actually by saving to an intermediate format, which I'll come to in a minute. It's important to recognize that to some extent these sidecar files, these files that are attached to raw files, which allow us to add sets of instructions when we open images, are often proprietary to the format that you're using. So we've got our raw files in. The software has created a version of that image. We've gone in, we've done our edits on it, we've done our culls, we've got rid of the ones we don't want, we've added star ratings, we've adjusted the exposure, we've done the global corrections, and then we decide that we want to take it one step further. We want to get a better result, or we want to do additional work on the image. And the most common way of doing that, although again not the only way, would be then to bring it into Photoshop. Now, Photoshop, unlike Lightroom and many of the others, is not a non-destructive. It's not a parametric editor. Actually, what Photoshop does is it moves pixels around. So it can't really work with the raw files. And I know everyone's going to go, oh, yes, it can, because it's got camera raw embedded in it. Yes, it can, because it has a plugin effectively built into it that's Adobe Camera Raw, which can do much the same jobs as you can do within DxO Photolab or Lightroom or all the others. But once you've actually done your edits within Adobe Camera Raw or within one of the other external editors, and then you want to do, for example, sharpness correcting, you want to do some fine detail, you want to do some really close selections, for example, which Photoshop is much better for much better selection tools than most of the others. Then what is commonly called retouching, although often that's not associated with underwater images, but it still is retouching. When we want to do that, we're going to have to probably get the file into Photoshop in a different format. And broadly speaking, there are two formats that people use. And the first one I'm going to deal with fairly briefly is something called a PSD, and it stands for Photoshop Document. And that's a Photoshop specific file, and it pretty much only works within Photoshop. But again, it's a big file, it saves the bulk of the data. And when you save something to PSD, it will preserve things like any layers or any other stuff that you've done in Photoshop, which then would theoretically allow you to go back in and change those layers. So it enhances your editability over time, which is possibly a positive. The downside, as I mentioned before, is PSD is Photoshop specific. So if you want to take that file and work in another app, say you want to take it into Topaz Sharpener or Topaz Denoise or one of the other Topaz applications, or into the Nik applications for converting to black and white using silver effects, for example, you would then have to export that PSD as another format in order to get it in there. So it's a complicated process, and this is why PSD, although it's quite a good format for working within Photoshop with, and if that's all you want to do with it, you want to consider possibly using it, but generally it tends to be less popular than a similar format called Tiff. TIFF. And TIFF basically is a very, very high quality copy of the file. They tend to be very big in size. They tend to contain a great deal of image information. They don't carry the same amount of image information as a raw file, but they still contain a great deal. And they are very editable and easily editable. And certainly in the past, when we submitted images for printing, particularly, most print houses, most publications wanted the images in TIFF format. And that was to get the maximum quality that they could on the page. Now, if you are storing a bunch of images that you plan to use for publication purposes, you're developing a book, or you supply a lot of stock photography to, I don't know, magazines, publications, then it makes sense in your pipeline to include a stage where you will save files as a TIFF. Because these are files that you will probably need. Certainly, if someone wants to print a poster, they're going to come to you, and they're probably going to want it in a TIFF format. So this is where it makes sense to save things as TIFF. TIFF, super high quality, a choice particularly for print shops, but for any application where you think the maximum image quality is necessary. Now, would I convert all my images to TIFF? Absolutely not, because my hard drives would get very full very quickly. To be honest, the vast majority of my files stay as raw files, and I don't really do a great deal with them unless I need specific raw files, and then for a particular purpose, I may then export them to TIFF. And I do have a portfolio, for want of a better word, of TIFF files, a folder of TIFF files that are immediately ready to go. They're caption keyword, all that kind of stuff, so that if a publisher rings me up and says, have you got a picture, or emails me now, have you got a picture of so-and-so, I can go, here it is, and send it straight on. I don't need to do anything with it. But I must say it's a relatively small folder, and I don't keep, by no means, it's probably a few hundred pictures compared to an image library of, I don't know, a couple of million images. So, okay. So TIFF file would be the images that you probably would your best that you might be selling as published images, or images that you see off printing. It could also be produced calendars or anything like that, possibly saved as a TIFF file. And then the last image format that I was going to mention today, and I have mentioned it before, so I need to sort of circle back round, is what's known as a JPEG. JPEG, JPEG stands for Joint Picture Expert Group, and primarily this is designed as a universal format, and largely designed to be used online. Originally, obviously, the internet, people put images on the internet. If each one was in an individual raw format, the internet would never cope with managing to decode it. So they sat down and devised an imaging format called JPEG, which is a universal format that will pretty much work with any web browser. It'll work on the internet. It will obviously work elsewhere as well. But it is very definitely a image format that has been shrunk in size. It's been compressed. It will have lost information compared to the original image file. There'll be much smaller files, which of course suits the internet particularly. And these are all your editing is limited on JPEG. Doesn't mean you can't you can't edit JPEGs. You can, but your image is much more limited, because particularly in Photoshop, you're going to start moving pixels around, and you're going to do that so many times before you start getting artifacts and stuff coming in. So it's very much a kind of image format that was really designed for using with online browsing. Now, having said that, increasingly now publishers are quite happy with a high-res JPEG. So a JPEG at full resolution of the camera, as long as the camera is 12 megapixels or beyond, which the vast majority of them are, the publishers will normally cope with that quite fine. They're quite happy. JPEG is an acceptable format. Obviously, this will be something, again, you might well go through your editing pipeline via your raw conversion process into possibly Photoshop, and then come out of Photoshop to save it as a JPEG. Now, for me personally, I tend not to keep many JPEGs. I may well post things out of JPEGs. In fact, when I'm sharing images on Facebook, or I'm sharing images online, or I'm sharing images with friends, that'll all be JPEGs. But I tend not to keep those folders. I tend to I produce a bunch of images, use them, and then we'll tend to delete them. I don't store stuff in JPEG because they're very much a file format that I think we use and then kind of forget, and then stop using. You don't have to do that. You could store everything as JPEGs, but I don't really see the sense, because as long as I have the raw file, I've got all the information. For the really good images, the images that I'm considering using for publication or for print, I will store as TIFFs, and the JPEGs are a much more disposable asset, I suppose. Of course, on my website, if you go to Hanlon Photography, hanlon-photography.com, there's lots of my images on there. Those are all JPEGs, and in actual fact, you can buy JPEG copies of images from there. But obviously, you couldn't buy raw images off there. And if you wanted a TIFF, you have to email for it, and I provide you with a TIFF. But obviously, so JPEG has its uses, but I think as a general format for storing images, for looking after images, it's limited. It's a tool that we use and probably discard afterwards. So in general, as I say, JPEG, high resolution JPEG, contains a great deal of data, but it's a much smaller file size, which makes it more portable, makes it much more possible to use on the internet when we obviously are limited by bandwidth and all those sorts of things. It also makes sense, if you're submitting proofs possibly to a printing house, or possibly submitting proofs for a particular event, you're on location, then rather than providing 150 TIFF files, which is going to take forever to send somewhere, you might produce 150 JPEG files, send them, ask them to select from those 150 JPEGs, and then produce the TIFF files they want, the ones they select, the 10 that they use in the article. So these are the kind of things that JPEG does very well, but it's important to bear in mind that I personally don't think there's much sense in storing JPEGs. I think once you've used the JPEGs, they're probably done, thrown away. Now, I'm aware that obviously there's some big gaps in what I've just discussed, in that I've moved fairly quickly over things like how we get between the various stages. Alex's video certainly will help. The video that Alex and I did about workflow will help with that. We are planning a future one where I'll discuss my workflow, and I'm sure this is a topic that we'll keep reverting to. There's also, say, some very good topics on the Wetpixel forum about this. I'll list those in the video description once I post this video. So I'd like to thank CCAM for sponsoring this episode very much. I'd like to thank you all for watching. I hope it hasn't been too dry and boring for you. If you got something out of it, please give it a like. Please also feel free to add to the discussion either in the comment section below this video, or alternatively on the forum, on the Wetpixel forum. Thank you very much.